got a book on it. So, but knowing that, as you mentioned, he's the laughing prophet, something that I find to be very, I'm drawn to that because you don't find that very often. You find people to be very somber, especially today. It's the Twitter wars, everybody's yelling at one another, the culture wars, so on and so forth. So to have kind of a conciliatory person who's I don't know if he would be in the Babylon Bee-esque place of a little satire, probably. I wouldn't put that past him, but looking at the church in America right now and that prophetic nature of how many of those things that he talked about have been come to bear in society. Where do you see the church at right now? Because you've written a lot on where we're at, what's going on, but where do you see the American church right now?
I'm working actually on I'm working on a podcast potentially to start about just addressing what I think is a credibility crisis in the US. And it's a credibility crisis in the US church for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think we'd all have to admit the sex abuse scandals that have touched virtually every denomination at some level those are horrifying, and those are there's nothing more damaging to the credibility of the church than seeing us not care for the least of these, or to have a blind eye or not be attentive to that conversation. So I think the ramifications of that are going to be with us for a long time. What I see happening right now in the American church, and one of the things that concerns me, is that when you see corruption in the church, which there is plenty of, when you see all sorts of excesses, leadership, toxic leadership stuff. I mean, people listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. And you see celebrity preachers, the fall of many of them, or you see people that weren't who we thought they were, people like Ravi Zacharias and others. There's that sense in which there's been a real reckoning, an unveiling, an apocalyptic moment in the church today. And it's happened both on the large scale with like well-known figures, but then it also happens on a smaller scale with stories that don't make headlines and yet leave people bewildered and wondering about the future of the church. I think the church is at a moment where there's a lot of rot in the church. And so it's a time for reformation and rebuilding. And unfortunately, a lot of times conservative leaning people, in order to protect the institution, wind up, not intentionally, but they wind up defending rot. And unfortunately, progressive leaning people, in order to purge the institution, wind up blowing up foundational pillars. Neither one of those serves the church well. You blow up foundations and sort of throw baby out with the bathwater, or you get rid of actually, like, for example, in the conversations about purity culture, there are aspects there are aspects of what was, kind of the whole push for true love waits and saving yourself for marriage and whatnot. There were aspects of the way that was taught in the 90s that were legalistic excesses that wound up being almost something of a pseudo prosperity gospel about sex. And I think a lot of it was well-intentioned, but I mean, Josh Harris, obviously, I guess dating would be an example of that. So conservatives, I think those who lean more conservative tend to just overlook some of those problems that were created in that sort of that attempt to increase, purity among a younger generation in which there was a lot of temptation in the world, wind up defending rot there. Some that is really against the gospel. Matt Chandler's Jesus Wants the Rose video is a good example of a gospel approach to some of that excess. On the other hand, I hear a lot of talk about purity culture as if it's completely a bad thing. Whereas I think in a lot of terms, a lot of people that are more progressive leaning believe the Christian sexual ethic altogether is repressive or harmful, or if that we're stressing, virginity among our kids, or if we're trying to, hold them to the standard that God sets out for their own good and for his glory, that somehow that in itself is harmful. And that's for me, that's an example of conservatives defending rot and progressives blowing up pillars and sort of detaching from the great Christian tradition. So I think the task for us in the next generation is going to be a lot of rebuilding. We talk a lot about deconstruction these days. I think there's going to have to be a reconstructing project that takes place in which we actually remove the rot and we fortify the foundations. And I think we can do that at the same time. To do that well, we're going to have to know the difference between rot and foundations. And I think the only way you can really discern the difference between those two, though, is to be acquainted with the church throughout history and be acquainted with the church around the world. We need a good dose of church history, and we need a really strong connection to the global church. And I think that's how you're able to get out of this American chaos right now and have the right kind of perspective on the moment and what we should do moving forward.